Have you ever had a moment where one tiny, like seemingly insignificant thing happens and you just completely snap?
Oh, yeah. Like all the time.
Right. It starts as a totally normal conversation, but the second someone disagrees with you or, they use a specific tone of voice, you just feel this massive surge of irritation.
Yes, it's like this restless, vibrating energy in your chest that literally makes you want to scream.
Exactly. And honestly, the worst part of that entire experience is the aftermath. Because the other person probably didn't mean anything malicious by it.
Right. They were just, being themselves.
But because they didn't meet your expectations in that split second, anger and resentment just completely hijack your brain. And then once the storm passes, you're left sitting there feeling like this deflated balloon.
Yeah, just absolutely drowning in guilt, hating the version of yourself that, well, lost control again.
It is such a brutal cycle. And today we are taking a deep dive into a really poignant essay that explores the hidden mechanics of this exact emotional volatility.
It really is a fascinating read.
It is. So our mission for this deep dive is to step directly into the shoes of someone who is, plagued by these mood swings. We're going to uncover how a neglected inner child triggers these adult meltdowns. And we'll also rigorously analyze why we are so relentlessly hard on ourselves.
I think that last part is so important.
Yeah.
Because we really are our own worst critics.
Totally. The feeling described in this text is basically like being held hostage by your own emotions while someone else has hidden the remote control. You desperately want to hit the pause button, but you physically can't.
Right. And to understand why that pause button feels completely broken, we actually have to look past the psychological labels for a moment. We need to examine the visceral, physical reality of these outbursts.
Because it's not just in your head.
No, not at all. There is a massive disconnect between how an emotional snap feels on the inside versus how it looks to the outside world.
Yeah.
The text describes a literal physical hijacking.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, your heart starts racing, your muscles tense up, and your breathing gets incredibly shallow.
See, when reading that description in the source material, it doesn't sound like typical anger at all. The racing heart, the tense muscles, that reads like a full-blown panic attack.
It really does.
It sounds like pure survival mode.
Because on a neurological level, it kind of is. The brain's threat detection center, the amygdala, is basically being hijacked. Our brains evolved to keep us safe from physical predators.
Right, like bears and tigers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But they aren't always great at distinguishing between a literal life or death threat, like a wild animal, and an emotional threat, like, say, a condescending tone of voice from a friend.
That is so wild. So it just reacts the same way to both.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
When that perceived emotional threat registers, your brain just floods your system with adrenaline. You become a startled animal on high alert.
Yeah.
And in that flooded state, your cognitive reasoning just shuts down. So a single stray comment can trigger a total meltdown.
Okay, so my brain is basically treating a minor disagreement like a saber-toothed tiger attack. But society doesn't see that, right? They don't see the internal adrenaline spike or the racing heart.
No, they just see the external reaction. The yelling or the sudden cold shoulder.
And because society only sees the reaction, they apply these heavy labels. People tell you that you're, too sensitive or that you're too emotional.
Or that you just have a bad temper.
Right. They say you're difficult to be around. They judge the explosion without ever stopping to ask the foundational question, which is what is actually going on to cause this level of distress.
And the essay points out a really tragic irony here. If you are the person experiencing this, you aren't actually looking for a fight.
No, not at all.
Most of the time, what looks to the outside world like a hostile tantrum is actually a desperate scream for someone to care as much as you do.
That is so heartbreaking.
It is. The source makes a really profound distinction on this point. It argues that you aren't inherently emotional or unstable. You are hurting. These outbursts almost always stem from going way too long without tenderness. You've just gone too long without being truly heard. And you don't need much in these moments, You just want someone who understands the silence in your eyes and the words you can't bring yourself to say, which are, I'm struggling too.
Wow. If this outburst is fundamentally a plea for connection, if it's just a symptom of caring too much and wanting to be understood, why does the brain translate, I need a hug, into, I am going to burn this house down? Where does that crossed wire even come from?
Well, to untangle that crossed wire, the text argues we actually have to travel back in time.
Back to childhood.
Exactly. The architect of these adult outbursts isn't really the adult self. It is the child you used to be. In psychology, people who struggle with emotional stability often have this very fragile, neglected child living inside them, just driving these reactions.
That makes a lot of sense.
The essay uses a very powerful, specific example to illustrate this conditioning. So imagine you were a little kid and you accidentally drop a glass, and it just shatters all over the kitchen floor.
Okay, so in an ideal, healthy environment, a caregiver comes over, checks if you're safe, sweeps up the glass, and gives you a comforting hug.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
But if, instead of a hug, you received a harsh lecture, or worse, a physical hit, you learn a completely different lesson about how the world works.
Oh, man.
You learn what it feels like to be aggressively blamed. You learn that making a mistake fundamentally means being punished, and that your caregiver's love is highly conditional.
So the takeaway for the child isn't just, don't drop glasses. The takeaway is my mistakes make me unlovable.
Exactly. And to survive in that unpredictable, scary environment, you adapt. You try endlessly to be a good kid.
Right, you just push everything down.
Yes, you suppress your natural reactions, you learn to people pleasers, and you learn to constantly walk on eggshells to avoid setting off the volatile adults around you.
It makes me think of outdated antivirus software running in the background of a computer.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Right. That hypervigilance was installed in childhood to protect you from a harsh family environment. It kept you safe back then. But now, decades later, that same software is freezing your whole adult operating system every time someone takes too long to text back.
That is a perfect analogy. And that outdated software directly morphs you into an adult who is incredibly hard on themselves.
Because you're still terrified of messing up.
Yes. You develop this vicious inner critic because you were terrified of making a mistake or displeasing someone. Your earliest conditioning hardwired you to believe that displeasing others results in an immediate loss of safety.
Wow.
But the text makes a crucial point here. Emotions don't just disappear because you suppress them. They just find a louder way to explode later.
So by trying to be the perfect, accommodating adult, by constantly walking on eggshells and pushing down our own needs, we are guaranteeing a massive explosion down the line. It's like a pressure cooker. We end up using anger as a bodyguard for that ignored inner child, don't we?
Anger is the ultimate bodyguard. When people see the temper, they're completely missing the fear underneath it.
Right, they just see the shouting.
Exactly. They don't realize you are using this explosive anger to protect a vulnerable child who is always ignored. A child who is forced to be perfect just to survive.
That is so profound.
You are difficult. You are exhausted. You are terrified. You are desperate to be held and understood and to just be allowed to be vulnerable for once without that lingering fear of punishment.
Okay, but if this buried inner child is standing guard, how does something as mundane as an unread text message bypass our rational adult brain and trigger that bodyguard to attack?
Well, the source material introduces a psychological framework to explain the mechanics of these daily reactions. It's referred to as the ABC theory.
Wait, I see ABC theory thrown around in self-help and psychology spaces all the time, but what does ABC actually stand for? Are we talking about a literal acronym here?
Yeah, it is a literal acronym. It originally comes from cognitive behavioral therapy. So A stands for the activating event. B stands for your beliefs about that event. And C stands for the consequence, which is your emotional reaction.
A, activating event. B, beliefs. C, consequence. Got it.
The central thesis of the ABC theory is that the activating event, the A, does not actually cause the consequence, the C. It is your beliefs, the B, that actually break you.
That is fascinating. Let's apply that to the exact scenarios from the text to see how it works in real time. Take the unanswered text message example.
Okay, so the activating event is simply that someone hasn't typed back on their phone. On a purely factual level, that is not inherently a disaster.
Right. I mean, their phone could be dead, they could be driving, or they could just be busy at work.
Exactly. But the belief, the B, is the internal script firing off in your head. The script says, if they cared about me, they would have replied immediately.
Oh, wow. And that belief leads directly to the consequence.
Yes, which is the emotional meltdown. The essay uses social media as another great example. So you post a photo and get 0 likes. Right, it hurts. But the activating event is just a lack of digital engagement. That's a neutral fact.
But your brain doesn't see it as neutral.
No, your VNIF interprets that lack of engagement through the lens of your childhood trauma. The script tells you that you aren't important, that you aren't likable, and that you are fundamentally alone.
So the fact doesn't hurt you, the interpretation does.
Exactly. It's your rigid belief about what people should have done, the script you wrote years ago, to feel safe getting violently torn to pieces by reality.
Hang on, I need to push back on this a little bit.
Sure, go ahead.
If the belief is the actual problem, does that mean we are basically just fighting our own imaginations? I mean, when the adrenaline is flooding my system and my heart is pounding out of my chest, how am I supposed to logically tell myself, oh, hey, this is just my faulty belief system? That feels pretty much impossible in the heat of the moment.
Oh, it is incredibly difficult because, like we discussed earlier, that amygdala hijack literally shuts down your logical brain. But recognizing that you are fighting your own internal scripts is the mandatory first move. When the adrenaline hits and that inner child feels threatened, you have to actively intervene.
So how do we actually do that?
Well, the source text outlines a sequence of actionable advice for answering this internal distress signal, even when your body is in full fight or flight mode.
I imagine the first step is like trying to calm down or something.
Actually, no. The very first step is to stop blaming yourself.
Really?
Yes. When you lose control, the immediate aftermath is usually immense shame. You beat yourself up. But you have to realize you aren't a bad person.
You're just reacting.
Exactly. You are just someone who has gone too long without being understood. You have to reframe the anger. That pain isn't random malice. It is just you fighting desperately to make people see what matters to you.
That makes total sense. Stopping the shame spiral has to happen first, because the guilt just reinforces that childhood trauma of being punished for mistakes all over again. But, okay, how do we stop the explosion before it happens? Say the text goes unanswered, the old antivirus software detects the threat, and I can feel the anger starting to rise. What then?
You have to force a wedge between the stimulus and your reaction. The source specifically mentions forcing a pause.
Yeah, that sounds great on paper, but realistically, when my blood is boiling, I'm not going to sit down and pull out a journal to analyze my feelings. How do you actually force that wedge when your brain is literally screaming at you to react?
Well, the pause isn't about sitting down to write a novel. It is about asking yourself one critical, life-altering question from the text.
Okay, what's the question?
Am I actually mad at this, or am I just sad because I feel ignored again?
Wow, am I actually mad at this, or am I just sad because I feel ignored again? That is a profoundly empathetic question.
It really is.
It forces you to look past the bodyguard of anger and literally check on the child underneath.
Exactly. It shifts you out of the reactive mode and into an analytical, compassionate mode. And once you identify that you are actually just sad, the text offers some really practical grounding techniques.
Like what?
Taking one single deep breath, applying self-compassion, stepping outside for a short walk, or sometimes simply sitting there and letting the feeling exist without acting on it at all.
Just letting it be.
Right. The key paradigm shift here is realizing that your emotions aren't a monster to be slain. They are a distress signal from your body. You have to start treating your emotional well-being as a priority rather than an inconvenience.
Which means it isn't about forcing yourself to be calm just so you can be more, palatable to other people. It's about giving yourself the gentleness you missed out on when you dropped that glass as a kid.
Exactly. Slowly, you realize that it isn't that you are unworthy of love, it's that you deeply deserve to be treated with gentleness.
That's beautiful.
And when you start providing that gentleness to yourself, the need for the explosive anger begins to fade. You just don't need a loud, hypervigilant bodyguard when you finally feel safe in your own mind.
I love that. This deep dive dramatically shifts the perspective on what it means to struggle with emotional volatility. If you are listening to this and you've been plagued by these overwhelming mood swings, the most important takeaway is that your emotional outbursts are not a sign that you are broken.
Absolutely not.
They do not mean you are inherently difficult, toxic, or unlovable.
The anger is just a heavy, exhausting shield protecting a hurting inner child.
Yes. By recognizing the ABCs of our reactions, understanding that our beliefs and internal scripts are triggering the adrenaline, not the events themselves, we can actually start to rewrite the narrative. We can update that old antivirus software.
We really can.
We can replace that heavy shield of anger with quiet self-love and steady compassion. We can force that wedge, take a breath, and ask if we're really mad or if we're just sad and feeling unseen.
It is a deliberate practice of slowly becoming the person you were always meant to be, long before the world taught you to be terrified of your own feelings.
Such a great point. So to wrap things up, if you have spent your entire life using anger to shield your heart and protect that neglected inner child, Who do you actually become when you finally feel safe enough to put that shield down? Think about that deflated balloon feeling we started with, the exhaustion of constantly exploding just to feel heard. If you no longer have to blow up to be seen, what does the unshielded, authentic version of you look like tomorrow morning?